Yeah, man! Uncle Doug, beat your feet on the Mississippi mud. Beat your feet on the Mississippi mud. Say, how come you keep clapping your hands?
In 1937, Swing Wedding was presented as just another colorful animated musical from MGM, but the initial reception revealed cracks that were hard to ignore. Behind the catchy music and praised animation were caricatures inspired by real figures, stereotypes already being questioned at the time, scenes that would disappear in future re-releases, and a plot reused almost without disguise. Throughout this video, we will explore 14 little-known facts that show how this short film passed through praise, criticism, and historical silence. Starting with the fact that its origin was never exactly original. Fact 1. Swing Wedding was never really an original idea. Despite being sold as a new musical celebration, Swing Wedding was born directly from the recycling of an earlier short, The Old Mill Pond, released just a few months before. MGM realized that audiences reacted well to the swamp setting, the caricatures of famous musicians, and the intense swing rhythm, so it reapplied virtually the same formula, adding only the context of a wedding. The plot is minimal, almost non-existent, serving only as an excuse to repeat musical numbers and familiar character types. This practice was not rare at the time, but here it went beyond simple aesthetic reuse. Certain sequences, camera movements, and even visual jokes follow the same rhythm as the earlier short, changing only who sings or appears in the spotlight. Even critics in the 1930s noticed this sense of deja vu, describing the cartoon more as a variation than as a new work. This barely disguised origin helps explain why Swing Wedding aged so uncomfortably. It was born looking backward, not forward, and this reuse opened space for even more questionable choices soon after. Fact 2. Almost all the characters were caricatures of real people. In Swing Wedding, practically no character was created from scratch. The frogs that occupy the swamp are deliberate caricatures of musicians and artists who were extremely well known at the time. The groom clearly resembles Stepin Fetchit, while other figures reference Cab Calloway, Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller, and even Ethel Waters. For audiences in 1937, these references were obvious and worked almost like a visual inside joke. The problem is that these caricatures did not stop at appearance or the way they sang. They exaggerated mannerisms, expressions, and behaviors already associated with racial stereotypes popular in American cinema. This made the cartoon immediately recognizable, but also uncomfortable, even for some critics at the time. It was not a neutral tribute, but rather an amplified distortion meant to generate quick humor. MGM knew the audience would recognize the faces and voices even without official credits, which helped sell the short. But that choice also aged poorly, turning the cartoon into a showcase of caricatures that today are analyzed far more than they are celebrated. And that leads us to the next point. Fact 3. The stereotypes were already a source of discomfort in 1937. There is an idea that Swing Wedding only began to be criticized decades later, but that is not entirely true. Even in 1937, part of the specialized press already showed discomfort with the excessive use of mannerisms and caricatured racial types. Exaggerated expressions, stylized speech, and behaviors attributed to the characters were recognized as worn conventions inherited from vaudeville and 1920s cinema. Some critics pointed out that the humor depended less on situation and more on the repetition of mannerisms, which weakened its artistic impact. Even so, the short passed without immediate cuts, largely because this kind of representation was widely normalized in the industry. MGM treated the criticisms as minor caveats, relying on the argument that it was just musical satire. The problem is that this normalization accelerated the cartoon's aging. What already seemed exaggerated in 1937 would become embarrassing a few decades later. This early unease helps explain why certain scenes did not survive intact in future screenings, and one of them would become particularly difficult to defend. Fact 4. The most discussed scene in the short almost went unnoticed at the premiere. Among the many musical numbers in Swing Wedding, there is a scene that today draws immediate attention, but in 1937 did not generate significant public reaction. In it, a musician uses a trumpet valve in a suggestive way before returning to play with exaggerated energy. At the time, the image was treated as just another quick visual gag, something designed to pass without without reflection. The problem lies in the subtext. The scene relies on existing cultural associations between jazz musicians and behaviors considered immoral or self-indulgent by popular stereotypes. Even without any direct mention, the gesture is clear enough to provoke discomfort when seen outside its historical context. Curiously, while our records indicate that the moment was not an immediate target of censorship, possibly because it passed too quickly, or because this kind of insinuation was tolerated when masked as humor. Decades later, however, the scene became the main example cited by critics when discussing the short's problematic legacy, and its impact helped justify silent changes in later exhibitions. Fact 5. The praise technique helped cover up the narrative problems. Despite the controversies, Swing Wedding was widely praised for its technical quality. The animation featured fluid movement, precise musical synchronization, and a use of color that stood out among MGM's shorts of that period. Hugh Harman and Rudolph Ising mastered the visual standard of the Happy Harmonies series, and this gave the cartoon a sophisticated appearance capable of distracting the audience from the content's weaknesses. Many critics of the time focused their comments on the energy of the scenes, the visual richness of the swamp, and the constant rhythm imposed by the music. The problem is that this technical excellence functioned like a layer of varnish, hiding an almost non-existent plot and repetitive creative choices. The story does not advance. It merely sustains a sequence of musical performances. As a result, any deeper questioning was muffled by the sense of spectacle. This imbalance between form and content helps explain why the short was admired in the short term, but rarely revisited later. And when the technical shine faded, the problems became impossible to ignore. Fact 6. The critical reception already pointed to clear signs of wear. At the time of its release, Swing Wedding received comments that mixed admiration and fatigue. Industry publications recognized the visual quality and immediate musical appeal, but several analyses implicitly suggested that the model was beginning to lose strength. Some critics noted that the cartoon seemed to rely more on repeating formulas than on real innovation, something that contrasted with the visible evolution in other studios. There was a sense that MGM was exploiting a style that had already reached its creative limit. Even praise came with caveats, such as the excess of musical numbers and the lack of narrative development. This type of reception did not prevent the short from circulating, but it contributed to it never being treated as an unquestionable reference within the studio's own catalog. Over time, these early observations gained weight, especially as audiences began to revisit the cartoon under new cultural values. What once seemed like mere creative fatigue began to be seen as a deeper problem, and this would directly influence how the short would be represented in the years that followed. Fact 7. The excessive musical format accelerated the short's aging. In Swing Wedding, music stops being a narrative element and comes to completely dominate the experience. The short virtually abandons character development or dramatic progression to accommodate a continuous sequence of musical numbers. This choice reflected a common trend in 1930s animation, but here the balance breaks. Instead of serving the story, the forced rhythm turns the cartoon into a showcase of isolated performances, connected only by the swamp setting. At the time of release, this still worked as immediate entertainment, but it drastically reduced its rewatch value. Without real conflict or consequence between scenes, the short depends exclusively on the momentary impact of the music. When the swing style began to go out of fashion, the cartoon quickly lost its main appeal. Unlike animations that combined music with durable visual humor, Swing Wedding became trapped in its own time. This excess contributed to the short being seen as dated within just a few decades, making its preservation more complicated. And this loss of relevance helped justify discrete changes in later versions. Fact 8. The short was quietly re-edited and re-released under another name. Some years after its debut, Swing Wedding reappeared in circulation under the title Hot Frogs, a shorter and slightly adjusted version. Officially, the re-release was never announced as censorship, but the change raised suspicions among animation historians. The new edition reduced the running time and reorganized musical sequences, softening the overall impact of the content. There was no statement explaining the criteria for these alterations, which was common at the time, since studios rarely admitted creative or cultural problems. To audiences, Hot Frogs seemed like just another generic musical cartoon, disconnected from the original context of Swing Wedding. This strategy helped keep the material in circulation without drawing attention to its controversies. At the same time, it diluted the identity of the original short, making it harder to trace its full history. As a result, Swing Wedding began to slowly disappear from traditional screenings, surviving more in archives and collections than in popular memory, and this intentional invisibility would have lasting consequences. Fact 9. Swing Wedding was almost never re rerun on television. Unlike many cartoons of the Golden Age, Swing Wedding had minimal presence on television in the decades that followed. While other MGM shorts were incorporated into syndicated packages and nostalgic programming cycles, this one was treated with caution. When it did appear, it was often shown without prominence, in off hours or within little publicized compilations. The reason was never officially explained, but the combination of sensitive content, obvious stereotypes, and uncomfortable scenes made the cartoon an unnecessary risk for programmers. Over time, it became easier to ignore it than to contextualize it. This absence helped erase Swing Wedding from popular memory, turning it into a curiosity known only to collectors and researchers. Curiously, this erasure was never formalized as a ban, which created a gray area around the short. It existed, but was rarely seen. And this kind of informal disappearance explains why the cartoon ended up being discussed more in academic texts than consumed as entertainment. Fact 10. The short came to exist more in analysis than in exhibition. Over time, Swing Wedding stopped circulating as popular entertainment and began to be cited mainly in critical and historical texts about the golden age of animation. Instead of frequent reruns, the short started to appear as an example in discussions about representation, stereotypes, and the limits of 1930s musical humor. This change in status is revealing. The cartoon was not completely erased, but repositioned as an object of study rather than celebration. Historians began to analyze it less for its music or animation, and more for the cultural choices that aged poorly. This shift helped preserve the material in archives and specialized collections away from the general public. At the same time, it reinforced its reputation as something difficult to screen without contextual explanation. Thus, Swing Wedding survived more in footnotes, essays, and academic debates than in the direct experience of the average viewer, and this ambiguous condition contributed to another little discussed curiosity about its historical legacy. Fact 11. Even so, Swing Wedding never entered official lists of censored cartoons. Despite its problematic representations, Swing Wedding was never formally included in official lists of censored cartoons, as happened with other titles from the same era. This causes some strangeness, since the short brings together several elements that would later be considered unacceptable for routine exhibition. The explanation lies less in the isolated content and more in how it was treated over time. Instead of being banned, Swing Wedding was simply ignored. Its gradual withdrawal from regular screenings made any public act of censorship unnecessary. In addition, the cartoon never achieved the iconic status of other problematic shorts, which reduced pressure for official decisions. Without constant reruns and without strong popular memory, it disappeared quietly. This strategic absence avoided broader debates and allowed the short to exist in a historical limbo known only by specialists. Paradoxically, this invisibility made it even more intriguing to researchers, and this discreet erasure helped quietly close a style that was already reaching its end. Fact 12. The historical timing made Swing Wedding a product out of place. Swing Wedding reached theaters in 1937, exactly at a moment of transition in American animation. Audiences were beginning to show interest in more dynamic narratives, characters with defined personalities, and visual humor less dependent on repetitive musical numbers. At the same time, studios faced deep internal changes, with questions about production models and the exhaustion of old formulas. In this context, the short already sounded like an echo of trends that were losing momentum. While Disney and Warner were seeking aesthetic and narrative renewal, MGM insisted on a style that seemed stuck at the beginning of the decade. This lag was not immediately obvious, but became clear in retrospect. Swing Wedding was not a failure, but it did not represent the future of animation either. It ended up being released in the exact gap between two eras, fully belonging to neither. This uncomfortable position contributed to its gradual disappearance and reinforced the sense that the short was a late remnant of a model that had already been exhausted. Fact 13. Hugh Harman and Rudolph Ising were closing a creative cycle. When Swing Wedding was produced, Hugh Harman and Rudolph Ising no longer occupied the vanguard position they had held at the beginning of the 1930s. The style they helped consolidate in the Happy Harmonies series was beginning to seem predictable in the face of the rapid evolution of commercial animation. The constant bet on music, intense color, and stylized characters no longer compensated for the lack of narrative renewal. Other studios were advancing with more aggressive visual humor, sophisticated comic timing, and characters with their own identity. Compared to this scenario, Harman and Ising's work sounded overly formal and tied to old conventions. Swing Wedding ended up functioning as one of the last clear examples of this approach. There was no technical failure, but there was evident creative wear. Shortly afterward, the duo would lose space within MGM itself, signaling the end of an era that could not fully adapt to changes in the audience. This exhaustion helps explain why the short feels more like a closing than a beginning, and the final fact closes this cycle definitively. Fact 14. Today, Swing Wedding survives more as a historical warning than as entertainment. Today, Swing Wedding is remembered less for its music or animation, and more for the discomfort it provokes when revisited outside its context. The short has come to be used as an example of how technically competent works can carry problematic cultural choices, even when celebrated in their time. In modern screenings, when they occur, it usually appears accompanied by warnings and historical context, making it clear that it should not be seen as acceptable representation. This shift in function is significant. Swing Wedding was not erased, but transformed into study material, almost a document of a specific period in the industry. It serves as a warning about the limits of satire, the risks of creative repetition, and how easily prejudices can be normalized under a layer of entertainment. Closing this sequence of facts, the short positions itself less as a classic and more as an uncomfortable portrait of an era we prefer to analyze critically rather than repeat without question. Swing Wedding did not disappear by accident. Between recycled creative choices, normalized stereotypes, and a format that aged quickly, the short ended up trapped between technical praise and historical discomfort. By revisiting these 14 facts, it becomes clear that this production reveals more about the limits of its time than about nostalgia. Sometimes, preserving also means confronting, not celebrating.